Disaster recovery planning exists to define how technology services are restored after disruption and to set clear expectations for what recovery actually means under stress. In practice, recovery is not a vague promise to bring things back eventually, and it is a set of explicit targets that shape architecture, operations, and investment decisions long before an outage occurs. When planning is weak, recovery becomes improvisation, and improvisation during a crisis tends to be slow, risky, and expensive. When planning is disciplined, teams know what matters most, what can wait, and what trade-offs have already been accepted. That clarity is what allows recovery work to proceed calmly, even when the disruption itself is chaotic. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CISS books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. One of the central concepts in recovery planning is the recovery time objective, which describes the maximum acceptable downtime for a service. This is not a technical measurement chosen by engineers alone, and it is a business decision that reflects how long an organization can tolerate loss of availability before impact becomes unacceptable. A short recovery time objective implies investment in redundancy, automation, and rapid failover, while a longer objective allows more manual processes and lower-cost designs. The key is that the objective must be realistic and understood by all stakeholders, because an unachievable target is worse than no target at all. When recovery time objectives are clear, they anchor design choices and response priorities during an actual incident. The recovery point objective complements downtime targets by defining the maximum acceptable data loss measured by time. Instead of asking how long a service can be unavailable, it asks how far back in time the organization is willing to lose data when restoration occurs. A tight recovery point objective implies frequent backups, continuous replication, or transaction-level protection, all of which increase complexity and cost. A looser objective accepts that some data may be lost, but that loss is understood and tolerated because it aligns with business value and risk appetite. Confusion between these objectives is common and dangerous because a system can meet a downtime target while still losing more data than the business expected. Clear articulation prevents that mismatch. Recovery tiers help translate abstract objectives into practical planning by grouping systems according to criticality and required restoration speed. Not every application deserves the same level of investment, and tiering provides a structured way to differentiate. Highly critical systems that support core operations or safety functions are placed in higher tiers with aggressive recovery targets. Less critical systems, such as internal reporting or non-essential collaboration tools, may be assigned lower tiers with longer restoration windows. Tiering allows teams to focus limited resources where they matter most and prevents over-engineering across the entire environment. It also supports communication during incidents because everyone understands which systems are prioritized and why. Dependencies are what make recovery planning complex because systems rarely operate in isolation. Identity services, network connectivity, and databases often sit beneath many applications, meaning their availability determines whether higher-level services can function at all. If an application is restored before its identity provider or database, it may appear available but remain unusable. Dependency mapping identifies these relationships, so recovery order is logical rather than arbitrary. This understanding also prevents false confidence, where a service is declared restored even though a critical dependency remains offline. Thoughtful dependency analysis, ensures recovery sequencing aligns with how systems actually work together. Backup strategy selection must align with recovery point objectives and practical storage constraints, because not all backups provide the same level of protection. Some backups capture full system images periodically, while others capture incremental changes more frequently. The choice affects how much data can be recovered and how long restoration takes, which directly impacts both recovery objectives. Storage cost, performance, and retention requirements also influence strategy because frequent backups generate more data that must be stored securely and managed. A mismatch between backup design and stated objectives leads to unpleasant surprises during recovery. Alignment ensures that what is technically possible matches what the business expects. Replication adds another dimension to recovery planning, and options generally fall into synchronous and asynchronous approaches with different trade-offs. Synchronous replication keeps copies tightly aligned, often across geographically separate locations, but it can introduce latency and complexity that affect normal operations. Asynchronous replication reduces performance impact but allows a gap between primary and secondary data, which translates into potential data loss during a failure. Choosing between these approaches requires understanding workload sensitivity, network reliability, and acceptable risk. Replication is powerful, but it is not a universal solution, and it must be applied where its benefits justify its cost and complexity. Clear objectives guide that decision. Failover procedures define how services switch to alternate infrastructure when the primary environment is unavailable. These procedures should specify triggers, decision authority, and technical steps so failover is deliberate rather than panicked. Automated failover can reduce downtime dramatically, but it must be tested carefully to avoid cascading failures or split-brain scenarios. Manual failover allows more control, but it depends on trained staff being available and decisive under pressure. In both cases, clarity matters, because hesitation during failover can cost more time than the actual outage itself. Well-defined procedures transform failover from an emergency gamble into a practiced action. Failback procedures are often overlooked, yet they are just as important as failover because returning workloads to the primary environment carries its own risks. Failback defines when and how systems move back, how data consistency is ensured, and how users are transitioned without disruption. Poorly planned failback can introduce data conflicts, performance issues, or repeated outages that undermine confidence. Planning for failback forces teams to think beyond immediate survival and toward long-term stability. When failback is designed thoughtfully, recovery becomes a controlled cycle rather than a one-way emergency move. Validation is the checkpoint that confirms recovery actually succeeded, rather than assuming success because systems are reachable. Validation steps verify data integrity, application functionality, security controls, and monitoring coverage after restoration. This includes confirming that restored data matches expectations, that authentication and authorization behave correctly, and that logging and alerts are functioning. Validation prevents the dangerous situation where a service is declared recovered but operates in a degraded or insecure state. By requiring explicit validation, teams avoid silent failures that surface later as incidents. Recovery without validation is incomplete recovery. Capacity planning is essential because alternate environments must handle expected load when they become primary, often under stressful conditions. An environment that is sufficient for testing or standby may not be sufficient for full production traffic. Capacity planning considers compute resources, storage performance, network bandwidth, and supporting services so restored systems can operate reliably. It also considers peak usage scenarios because disruptions often occur during high-demand periods. Without adequate capacity, recovery may technically succeed while still failing the business due to poor performance. Planning capacity ahead of time avoids that outcome. Access controls take on heightened importance during recovery because elevated privileges and emergency tooling are often used. Recovery tooling can perform powerful actions such as restoring data, changing configurations, or redirecting traffic, and misuse can cause significant harm. Access should be limited to authorized roles, protected by strong authentication, and logged for accountability. During a crisis, pressure to bypass controls is common, but doing so can introduce new risks or obscure responsibility. Maintaining disciplined access control during recovery protects both security and trust. It ensures that urgency does not become an excuse for uncontrolled change. Testing is the only way to demonstrate that recovery time and recovery point objectives are achievable in practice rather than aspirational on paper. Tests reveal whether procedures work as expected, whether dependencies were correctly identified, and whether staff can execute under realistic conditions. They also expose gaps that are invisible during planning, such as missing credentials, outdated documentation, or insufficient capacity. Testing should reflect real scenarios rather than idealized drills, because realism is what builds confidence. Each test provides data that can be used to refine objectives and designs. Without testing, recovery plans remain hypotheses rather than proven capabilities. Disaster recovery planning ultimately relies on recovery time and recovery point objectives to anchor design and restoration expectations across the organization. These objectives translate business tolerance into technical requirements that guide architecture, operations, and investment. Recovery tiers, dependency analysis, backups, replication, and failover all exist to serve those targets rather than to satisfy abstract best practices. Validation, access control, capacity planning, and testing ensure that recovery works when it is needed most. When objectives are clear and plans are practiced, recovery becomes a controlled response rather than a desperate scramble. That discipline is what allows organizations to endure disruption without losing trust or momentum. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.